to take on Islamic State on the ground. In other words, America already had partners with guns that it could rely on, or at least hope to rely on, in Iraq. It had nothing equivalent inside Syria. So while it was conducting a campaign, there was no sense of any kind of pressure on the ground. So it launched this process, a program that was approved by Congress, and the money was provided to try and single out people who could be trained. They were vetted, they were sent off. But the reality is that only 60 people, in fact 54, is the exact number, were trained in Jordan and in Turkey, and were then dispatched across the border into Syria, armed with new kit and new pickup trucks. And they were immediately confronted by Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate inside Syria. Why would Jabhat al-Nusra want to attack this group, the 30th Division? Well, because probably America has been bombing Jabhat al-Nusra, not just Islamic State, but also the Al-Qaeda branch inside Syria. And so they saw this group pretty much as American stooges, and they were waiting for them. They knew they were coming. Some were detained, and this huge skirmish developed, this gun battle. Some were killed, some were captured, and others essentially still trapped inside Syria. So we managed to speak to an officer with this American-trained group, the 30th Division. His name is Amr al-Awawi, and he's spoken to us, criticizing the US and the coalition.
There are no international guarantees or an official protection for the 30th Division.
And yet the Americans have announced very clearly that they will provide air support to the 30th and to other groups.
10 hours before the attack, we sent a written statement and made an official call to those responsible. We said that Nusra Front was attacked at 4 a.m. We told them that at 6 p.m. But it wasn't until 2 hours after the attack that the coalition forces bombed Nusra. They didn't provide any support to the 30th Division during the
Sorry, and what impact has all of this had on the 30th Division? Well, it's pretty much a shattered group. There are still surviving members. There are some clearly outside the country in Turkey, but there's still some still trapped inside, and there are no other veteran fighters yet to come on board. Now, we put this to the Pentagon. One of my colleagues in Washington, Gary O'Donoghue, spoke to the Pentagon about this, and they first of all said they didn't know anything about a delay in the airstrikes coming, which was one of the accusations from the 30th Division. He said that the operation, as far as he knew, was a success, and that Nusra was beaten back. I think many people on the ground see the situation very, very differently. And the 30th Division officer who spoke to me was amazed at the seeming disparity between the success of Islamic State, or what he called Daesh, and the American-trained fighters.
هل يعقل لشباب الآفاق تنظيم داعش أن يتشكل How come Daesh is created in a very short time, 6 to 12 months, then fights the entire world in Iraq and Syria, and occupies 50% of both Syria and Iraq without international support? But this plan, that's backed by many countries, trained only 54 fighters in 6 months.
Well, the sense really of the frustration they're in. Yes, I think there is frustration, there's anger, and there's genuine emotion there. These people have invested a lot. They haven't just come out of the blue. Many of these people have been fighting against the government of Bashar al-Assad for a long time. Many have lost relatives. Many of their families are now living overseas, or are living in neighboring Turkey, or in refugee camps. So for them, this is very, very personal, and they've bought into something at great personal risk. I mean, this particular officer talked about being under threat from Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, close to him and his family. And yet he kind of reads the papers, he knows what's being printed in the New York Times, what the Americans are briefing, and he essentially disputes America's ambitions and the way that the plan is laid out at the moment. The Americans are ready to train and form a national army of 15,000 fighters, and they say they're ready to back it financially and militarily, in addition to the air cover. But the truth is that during the 6 months, only 60 fighters have been trained,
And if only 60 fighters get trained every 6 months, we will need decades to train 15,000. I mean, Ian, given these misgivings, are these people going to continue? What are they saying?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, we don't know. At the moment, they're still in crisis management. They're trying to negotiate with the Nusra Front to get the release of their comrades, and they're not very hopeful. They've called for help with that process. People say, Nusra Front are getting weapons in, they're getting support in across the border with Turkey from, they call friends and allies, other countries. He's not specific about that. And he feels that they've been left on their own. Again, we put the question to the American military whether or not they would help. The rest now is the people who are stranded there and those who've been captured. No real details at the moment. So I think they're in crisis management mode. It's hard to imagine that the 30th Division in any form will continue to last. I think the question is what happens to the second and third tranche of fighters who are due to graduate from this training program. Will it actually be enough? I mean, if you can't get more than a mile into Syria without facing opposition from other rebel groups, it's difficult to know how you're actually going to develop a program to take on Islamic State on the ground. I think it needs some serious rethinking.
Ian Channel on the Turkish-Syrian border, while we try to get our own interview with the Pentagon, but no one has yet been made available. Robert Ford was the U.S. ambassador to Syria until last year. He's now a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. So what do you make of this seemingly inauspicious start to the U.S. training program?
It's a terrible start. It's an awful start. And the program from the beginning had serious structural problems. The entire vision of the program made little sense when they insisted that the fighters, the Americans would train, pledged, in writing no less, that they would only fight the Islamic State and never fight the Assad regime, even though, as your correspondent mentioned, the Assad regime has been fighting them for 4 years and killing far more Syrians than the Islamic State ever did, as awful as the Islamic State is.
And it seems that they were attacked not by the Assad regime, not by Islamic State, but by a third party, Jabhat al-Nusra.
Well, multiple problems here. Number one, the insistence that fighters pledge not to fight Assad has limited the number of recruits. So, as you mentioned, they only got about 54 in this first tranche, which is not a serious number, and it's not a number that's going to accomplish anything in battlefields where there are at least several thousand men deployed on the various sides. Second problem is the Americans didn't have a good sense before they started as to whether or not they would provide close air support, and so there were the delays that you talked about. Now, that could be worked out. Close air support from the United States really did help the Syrian Kurdish militia who were fighting the Islamic State in northern Syria over the past 8 months. Really did help. But that's got to be ironed out. And the bigger problem, though, really is, will people with the United States trained, but who pledge to fight only Assad, will they be viewed as loyal, patriotic Syrians fighting in this horrible civil war by the other armed groups, or will they be viewed as American stooges and basically as an American fifth column, and therefore they will be more or less on their own all the time?
I suppose looking at it from the other side, if American taxpayers are paying for these people to be trained, the U.S. government needs to be clear that they are training the good guys, don't they? I mean, a lot of the problem with this is the vetting, which has taken some time, but there's really no way around doing detailed background checks like this.
Well, I think the vetting probably is too much at this point. There isn't going to be anybody whose hands are perfectly clean in the Syrian civil war. For 4 years, and it's very bloody. 300,000 casualties.
So it's okay if a few bad guys slip through? Being paid for by American taxpayers?
I do not think, even if you do the best vetting you can, you will catch all of the bad guys. Let's be honest. This is an intelligence issue, and intelligence is never, ever perfect in my experience. But there's a bigger question here, which is not just the vetting. It's, do the Americans have a strategy? Do the Americans have a strategy which will, in fact, lead to, A, reducing the recruitment into the Islamic State to better contain it, and B, do the Americans have a strategy that will bring this horrible civil war in Syria, which drives recruitment into the Islamic State. Do the Americans have a strategy to deal with that? And the answer in both is no.
Well, there's some positive developments, I suppose. Well, some positive developments have been, of course, the new level of cooperation from Turkey. Today we've seen American planes take off from Turkish airbase, hasn't it, and carry out bombing raids. But then, of course, you do have the question of who is being bombed, the question of civilian casualties as well. I mean, do you think that is a positive development, that Turkey is now on board?
It's a positive development, for sure, but it's not a game changer, because the Islamic State fundamentally is not a military problem. It's a political problem. Where did the Islamic State come from? It came from a political problem, a crisis in Syria itself, which was driven by politics. And you're not going to be able to bomb the Islamic State into oblivion. We just had stories based out of American intelligence sources earlier this week on the Associated Press that said that American intelligence estimates that the Islamic State basically replaced all of their casualties from American bombing with new recruits during the past year. So you got to deal with the politics.
A very, very short space of time. What is the priority now?
Well, the priority should be, the American priority is the Islamic State, and it's a priority which will really never lead to a viable solution until the Americans broaden their attention to the broader civil war, which is what countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia have been urging the Americans to do since 2011, 2012.
And that was the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, passing the news hour from the BBC World Service. And coming up in half an hour's time on the program, how old should children be when we start talking to them about sex?
If you're watching together with your child, Bob the Builder, and he's acting nice towards Wendy, you could say, oh, maybe he's in love with Wendy. Oh, do you think he wants to kiss her then? Or you can ask what the child thinks about it and see how he reacts.
Wilson and women are trying to fix the question of sex education before the end of the program. Now, remind us about main stories. Malaysia's Prime Minister says that aviation experts have confirmed conclusively that aircraft wreckage found on an island in the Indian Ocean last week is from a missing Malaysian airliner. And rescuers are searching the Mediterranean for hundreds of migrants who are missing after their boat capsized off the coast of Libya. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC World Service, and we're now going to play you an interview with someone talking about his job, a job that's been keeping him very busy. Stay tuned, though, it is a rare and rather revealing interview, because the man's name is Sabir Masi. He is from Pakistan, and he's a hangman. Since Pakistan lifted its moratorium